Is there free will? As an introduction to the concept of free will, I will quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Quote, "The term free will has emerged over the past 2 millennia as the canonical designator for a significant kind of control over one's actions. Questions concerning the nature and existence of this kind of control, e.g., does it require and do we have the freedom to do otherwise, or the power of self-determination, and what its true significance is it necessary or moral responsibility or human dignity, have been taken up in every period of Western philosophy and by many of the most important philosophical figures such as Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, and Kant. In this way, it should be clear that disputes about free will indubitably involve disputes about metaphysics and ethics. In ferreting out the kind of control involved in free will, we are forced to consider questions about, among others, causation, laws of nature, time, substance, ontological reduction versus emergence, the relationship of causal and reasons-based explanations, the nature of motivation, and more generally of human persons. In assessing the significance of free will, we are forced to consider questions about, among others, rightness and wrongness, good and evil, virtue and vice, blame and praise, reward and punishment, and desert. The topic of free will also gives rise to purely empirical questions that are beginning to be explored in the human sciences. Do we have it, and to what degree? So, to examine the determinist point of view, I quote from author and neuroscientist Sam Harris from his book Free Will. Quote, "We are conscious of only a tiny fraction of information that our minds process in each moment. Although we continually notice changes in our experience, in thought, mood, perceptions, behavior, etc., we are utterly unaware of the neurophysiological elements that produce them. In fact, we can be very poor witnesses in experience itself. By merely glancing at your face or listening to the tone of your voice, others are often more aware of your state of mind and motivations than you are." The physiologist Benjamin Libet famously used EEG to show that activity in the brain's motor cortex can be detected some 300 milliseconds before a person feels that he has decided to move. Another lab extended his work using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. Subjects were asked to press one of the 2 buttons while watching a clock composed of a random sequence of letters appearing on a screen. They reported which letter was visible at the moment they decided to press one button or the other. The experimenters found 2 brain regions that contained information about which button subjects would press a full 7 to 10 seconds before the decision was consciously made. More recently, direct recordings from the cortex showed that the activity of merely 256 neurons was sufficient to predict with 80% accuracy a person's decision to move 700 milliseconds before he became aware of it. These findings are difficult to reconcile with the sense that we are the conscious authors of our actions. One fact now, indisputable: some moments before you are aware of what you will do next, a time in which you subjectively appear to have complete freedom to behave however you please, your brain has already determined what you will do. You then become conscious of this decision and believe that you are in the process of making it. If the laws of nature do not strike most of us as incompatible with free will, that is because we have not imagined how human behavior would appear if all cause and effect relationships were understood. There is a distinction between voluntary and involuntary actions, of course, but it does nothing to support the idea of free will, nor does it depend on it. And a voluntary action is accompanied by the felt intention to carry it out, whereas involuntary action isn't. Needless to say, this difference is reflected at the level of the brain. And what a person consciously intends to do says a lot about him. It makes sense to treat a man who enjoys murdering children differently from one who accidentally hit and killed a child with his car, because the conscious intentions of the former give us a lot of information about how he is likely to behave in the future. But where intentions themselves come from and what determines their character in every instance remains perfectly mysterious in subjective terms. Our sense of free will results from a failure to appreciate this. We do not know what we intend to do until the intention itself arises. To understand this is to realize that we are not the authors of our thoughts and actions in the way that people generally suppose. Suppose what it would take to actually have free will. You need to be aware of all the factors that determine your thoughts and actions, and you would need to have complete control over those factors. But there's a paradox here that vitiates the very notion of freedom. For what would influence the influence? More influences? None of these mental states are the real you. You are not controlling the storm, and you are not lost in it. You are the storm. Another figure who subscribes to determinism is none other than Gura, whom I've made several montages of on this channel, a philosopher and spiritual teacher. Leo argues that there are so many factors that determine our decision-making of which we have little control over. We have limited, if any, control over the systems that operate our bodies, from our immune system to even our breathing. There's trillions of cells in the human body that act as operators in our decision-making process. Within all these units emerge more complex, higher-order phenomena. So to us as a conscious being, we feel as if we are a singular entity. However, of these trillions of cells, there's nothing we can point to that definitively is us making the decisions, but a larger system with emergent properties. So if we use a search engine as a comparison, is the search engine the homepage that we are familiar with as the user? Or is the search engine all of the computer code, employees, and mechanisms that went into the creation of the search engine? Perhaps both. This makes us question the very concept of the self and identity, and ego, as we identify, is an illusion. Even Sam Harris, as an atheist, admits this. So anybody who has experience with meditation notices how things just generate in their minds and how little control they have over their thoughts. An objection to the determinist view could go something along the lines of, well, if there's no free will, what's stopping me from sitting with my thumb up my ass, playing Xbox, eating Cheetos, and fapping to Pornhub all day? The parts of a system, such as a computer, do not have free will. However, there are still mechanisms at play which keep the parts in motion and functioning. Leo examines that when we have a look at martial artists or monks, some of the most disciplined people we can think of, after thousands of hours of training, their body and their minds, they're in a flow that their mind and their being is accustomed to. And by realizing there's no self, the ego is an illusion, they can tap into this greater flow of things. This can kind of sound a bit lofty, but very practically speaking from this perspective, just because there is no free will doesn't mean there isn't a routine and momentum to things. He also distinguishes between being a victim and no free will, and I'll provide a link to the whole lecture in the description. So in my own personal experience with this topic in regard to free will, I've actually had a number of experiences, especially after meditating, where I felt as if I didn't have control over anything whatsoever, and everything felt completely automatic and as if it was just unfolding. And to make a comparison, it felt as if I went from being in a game to being in a movie where things were just unfolding. This can be particularly frightening while driving or operating heavy machinery. So we've established the determinist argument as to whether or not free will. So now those who believe that we have free will refer to our direct experience in terms of how we actually interact with each other on a daily basis, for instance. If we take a look at our legal system, for instance, it is based upon the assumption that you are entirely responsible for your moronic decisions. It'd be interesting to see what a legal system would look like under determinism, and whether that would be more compassionate or less compassionate than our current one. So I quote from Dennett, philosopher and cognitive scientist. Quote, "We want to determine our actions, but we don't want to ourselves be determined in the determining of our actions." His argument is that we are more than the sum of our parts. Our parts do not have free will, but we do, as entities. He argues that this is possible because something may be determined, but the outcome is not inevitable. Then it also gives the example of a brick falling, that it is a determined event, but you getting hit with the brick is avoidable. Because you have the choice of dodging the brick, he defines free will as our capacity to see probable futures and time to see that something else happens instead. And Dennett looks to biology to support his view on free will, but it's compatible, and that it is compatible with the strictly physics-based view of determinism. To have a look at another figure's point of view, we look to Peterson. And Peterson and Sam Harris are actually intellectual rivals, even though they're both part of what is called the intellectual dark web. Peterson argues that we in fact do have free will if we go based off of our direct experience.
Sam Harris is one of the four famous, atheists, along with Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett. Yeah, and so we were having a discussion, and he's a determinist, just right down to the bottom. It's like you're determined, there's no free will, you're a deterministic machine. And if you're a coherent scientist and you're a Newtonian, roughly speaking, you don't really have much choice other than to think that way, but that isn't how it seems to people, and we don't treat each other that way. And our entire legal system is predicated on the idea that you do in fact have free will. So, well, can we account for it? Well, no. And do we have a scientific model for it? No. But then I would also say we do not have a scientific model for consciousness. We don't know a damn thing about consciousness, which is why Dan Dennett's book, which was called Consciousness Explained, was referred to by its critics as Consciousness Explained Away, which is exactly right as far as I'm concerned, because he took a mechanistic approach, and I just don't think you get to do that, because there's something really weird about consciousness. I mean, the phenomenologists like Heidegger, who tried to radically transform Western philosophy right from the bottom up, he basically said, well, you can treat the world as if consciousness is primary and that human experience is reality, that's reality, and that it doesn't exist independently of consciousness in any explicable way. It's like, well, what's out there if there's nothing to experience it? Well, everything at once. It's something like that. It's not really comprehensible. As without a subject, the subject defines it and makes it real. Now, you don't have to believe that, but at least I'm telling you that there are thoroughly coherent philosophical positions that make that case very strongly, and that allow consciousness to exist as a phenomena and to take it seriously. And you certainly act like you take it seriously. You act like there's a you and that you make choices, and you certainly treat other people that way. Deterministic or not, you're still going to get angry when they're being, rude to you, and you're going to act as if they had some choice in the matter. Now, maybe that's an illusion, possibly, but maybe it's not.
So here we're going to go a bit far out and philosophical and refer to Alan Watts on this determinism versus free will debate. Now, Watts has an interesting take on this, which is that perhaps it's not total determinism or total free will, but that there is, in fact, an interplay of the two at hand.
So you see, you couldn't have the experience you call being a voluntarily acting self without the contrast of the involuntary happening. Now, do you want to be without the involuntary happening? Do you want to get rid of that? All right. If you get rid of it, you won't have the experience of the voluntary self. Or would you like to turn it the other way around? Would you like to have the experience of no voluntary self, and on the other hand, everything just happens? Well, then you say, well, I'm not sure about that. Because then I would feel at first that I was floating. See, that I had no further responsibilities, that I was just walking on air. And we do get that feeling sometimes. If you take the ideas of determinism and fatalism to their final conclusion, you do have that sense of freedom from all responsibility, freedom from worry and care. And you float along for a while, but it wears off. You don't somehow seem to be able to follow out that philosophy consistently, especially if you have children. And somehow a society begins to push on you to be responsible, as it pushes on children to be responsible. And so this nagging duality keeps coming back. That I cannot realize the nice irresponsible condition of involuntary behavior unless I have the contrast of the possibility of the voluntary, and vice versa. Now what does that mean? Obviously it means that these two aspects or sides of our experience, which we can call the voluntary and the involuntary, the knower and the known, the subject and the object, the self and the other, although appearing to be two, are indeed one.
So, do we have free will? Well, to me, a more precise question would be, how much free will do we have? To what extent do we have free will? From a strictly materialistic point of view, from physics, for instance, reality is determined because every event is linked back to every other event going to the Big Bang. But we are an incredibly complex organism with trillions of cells which contribute to all of our decision-making and cravings, for instance. However, would we necessarily want to have direct control over everything in order to have free will? From a philosophical point of view, as Alan Watts pointed out earlier, if physical reality is, in fact, determined, there must also be a voluntary will as contrast. So, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Leave me a comment down below as to your thoughts on free will and determinism. Maybe share with a friend who's also having a bit of a struggle determining which is which and would like a little bit more background on this subject. So, and feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay updated with all of the resources down below and the platforms that Focus Shift posts content to. And if you'd like to support the work of Focus Shift, feel free to become a patron. I have a lot of ideas for short films and animations and things of that nature coming up in the future. So you are of no obligation. We will still continue to make content, but if you support us and would like to send us your support, it would be of great appreciation, along with access to early posts and exclusive content. I am Parker Tebow, head of Focus Shift Media, and I am signing off. Have a glorious week.